In the vast tapestry of comic book mythology, few concepts challenge our fundamental understanding of heroism and villainy, quite like the tale we are about to unfold. When the familiar panels of Batman and Joker dissolve before our eyes, only to re-emerge with their colours inverted, we are forced to confront a disturbing question that cuts to the very heart of what we believe about justice, chaos, and the thin line that separates salvation from damnation. What if the agent of chaos became Gotham's guardian, and its dark night felt a shadow? What if the man who taught us to fear the sound of laughter was actually the city's greatest hope, while the symbol of justice we revered was nothing more than a mask hiding our deepest nightmares? This is not merely a thought experiment or an academic exercise in moral relativism. This is the documented chronicle of a world where the impossible became inevitable, where the very foundations of heroic mythology were shattered and rebuilt from the fragments of shattered expectations. Through archival footage, expert testimony, and the painstaking reconstruction of events that defied all logical explanation, we present the definitive account of how Gotham City learned to love the man in white and fear the creature that lurked beneath the cowl. The story begins, as all great myths do, with birth and tragedy, but not in the way we have been conditioned to expect. Arthur Wayne entered this world as the heir to a dynasty built on compassion and comedy, a peculiar combination that would prove prophetic in ways no one could have anticipated. The Wayne family fortune had been amassed not through the traditional means of industrial conquest or corporate manipulation, but through a unique blend of philanthropic ventures and entertainment enterprises that brought joy to the masses while lifting them from poverty. Thomas Wayne was not merely a doctor who ministered to the physical ailments of Gotham's citizens. He was a man who understood that laughter could heal wounds that no surgery could reach. Martha Wayne, née Kane, brought her own particular genius to this union. A former circus performer turned social worker, she had dedicated her life to the belief that even the darkest corners of human experience could be illuminated by the simple act of finding something to smile about. Together, they raised their son Arthur in an environment where wealth was viewed not as a privilege to be hoarded, but as a responsibility to be shared through acts of service that brought light to others. The tragedy that would define Arthur Wayne's destiny unfolded on a night that should have been filled with laughter. The family had attended a performance at the Gotham Opera House, but instead of the traditional tragic tale of betrayal and death, they had chosen to see a comedy revue that Thomas Wayne had helped finance. As they walked through the same alley that in another universe would witness the birth of Batman's mission of vengeance, the shots rang out with the same cruel finality. But as Arthur knelt beside his dying parents, something remarkable happened that would echo through the corridors of history. Instead of succumbing to rage or despair, the young heir found himself overwhelmed by an emotion that shocked even him in its intensity. As his father's blood pooled beneath his knees and his mother's final breath escaped in a sound eerily reminiscent of laughter, Arthur Wayne began to smile. Not the twisted grin of madness or the bitter smirk of cynicism, but a genuine expression of profound understanding. In that moment of ultimate darkness, he grasped a truth that would become the cornerstone of his life's work. That the only way to defeat the cruelty of an indifferent universe was to refuse to let it steal your capacity for joy. The training that followed was unlike anything the world had ever seen. While other wealthy orphans might have travelled the globe seeking masters of martial arts or the secrets of fear, Arthur Wayne pursued a different path entirely. He studied under circus performers and street magicians, learning to transform objects of potential harm into instruments of wonder. He mastered 17 different forms of hand-to-hand combat, but focused primarily on techniques designed to subdue rather than injure, to disarm through distraction rather than destruction. His gadgets, developed in the rebuilt Wayne Industries laboratories, bore little resemblance to the dark implements of war that might have emerged from a more conventional hero's workshop. Flower grenades that burst into clouds of harmless but disorienting confetti, grappling hooks shaped like oversized playing cards, and a utility belt stocked with joy buzzers capable of delivering non-lethal electrical charges that left criminals more confused than hurt. Every device was painted in bright primary colours, and many incorporated elements of classic carnival equipment repurposed for crime-fighting applications. But perhaps the most radical aspect of Arthur Wayne's transformation was his approach to costume design. Instead of donning the dark colours of night and fear, he chose a brilliant white suit that seemed to glow under Gotham's streetlights. The purple vest and tie added a touch of theatrical flair, while the green hair dye he applied each morning served both as a personal memorial to his parents' belief in the power of unconventional beauty and as a psychological weapon against criminals who found themselves unable to take seriously a man who looked like he had stepped out of a playing card. The white face paint was applied with the precision of a master craftsman, creating a visage that was simultaneously unsettling and oddly comforting. The red lips, stretched into a permanent smile, served as a constant reminder to both himself and others that joy was not merely an emotion but a choice, a deliberate act of rebellion against the forces of darkness that sought to consume the human spirit. Meanwhile, in another corner of Gotham, a very different kind of transformation was taking place. Bruce Napier had been born into circumstances that could hardly have been more different from Arthur Wayne's privileged upbringing. His father, Jack Napier, was a struggling comedian whose career had been marked by more failures than successes, more humiliations than triumphs. The family's modest apartment in the Bowery district of Gotham bore witness to countless nights when Jack would return home from yet another disastrous performance, his face still bearing the red marks where thrown objects had found their target. Bruce's mother, Sandra Napier, worked double shifts at a chemical plant to make ends meet, her body slowly being poisoned by industrial compounds that would eventually claim her life before her son reached his 15th birthday. The Napier household was a place where laughter was not a source of joy, but a weapon used by others to inflict pain, where the sound of an audience's mockery echoed through thin walls and thinner hopes. The pivotal moment in Bruce Napier's journey toward darkness came not through a singular traumatic event, but through a gradual accumulation of humiliations that finally reached a breaking point. On the night of his 12th birthday, his father had arranged for a special performance at the Gotham Comedy Club, promising his son that this would be the night everything changed. Bruce had dressed in his only good clothes and sat in the front row, his heart swelling with anticipation as his father took the stage. What followed was perhaps the most brutal character assassination ever witnessed in a Gotham entertainment venue. The audience, filled with wealthy patrons from the upper-class neighbourhoods, who had come to the club as part of a slumming expedition, turned Jack Napier's earnest attempts at humour into a feeding frenzy of ridicule and contempt. They laughed, but not with him. They laughed at him, at his second-hand costume, at his desperate attempts to win their approval, at the very idea that someone from his social class might presume to entertain his betters. Bruce watched in horror as his father's spirit was systematically destroyed in front of an audience that treated human dignity like a commodity to be purchased and discarded. When Jack finally stumbled off the stage, his face streaked with tears of humiliation, Bruce felt something cold and sharp take root in his chest. It was not sadness or sympathy, but a burning desire to make those who had laughed pay for their cruelty. The accident that would complete Bruce Napier's transformation occurred 3 years later, during a spelunking expedition organised by his high school biology class. While exploring a cave system on the outskirts of Gotham, Bruce became separated from the group and fell through a rotted wooden platform into a chamber that had been sealed off from the main tour route. As he lay stunned in the darkness, his flashlight having been shattered in the fall, he became aware that he was not alone. The bats came first as a rustling sound in the darkness, then as a chittering chorus that seemed to emanate from every direction at once. But instead of the terror that such creatures might inspire in others, Bruce felt an immediate kinship with these predators of the night. They were perfectly adapted to their environment, capable of navigating in complete darkness, and utterly without mercy when it came to hunting their prey. As dozens of them swirled around him in the darkness, Bruce experienced what he would later describe as a moment of perfect clarity. He understood, with a certainty that bordered on religious revelation, that the world was divided into two categories of people, predators and prey, those who laughed and those who were laughed at, those who possessed power and those who suffered under it. The bats had shown him which category he was meant to inhabit. The fortune that would fund Bruce Napier's transformation into the creature that would terrorize Gotham came not through inheritance or honest enterprise, but through the methodical exploitation of a broken system designed to reward the ruthless at the expense of the vulnerable. Using his considerable intellect and complete absence of moral constraints, Bruce developed a series of technology startups that appeared to offer revolutionary solutions to urban problems while actually creating new mechanisms for surveillance and control. His most successful venture, Nocturnal Dynamics, ostensibly developed advanced security systems for high-crime neighborhoods, but actually created a network of surveillance equipment that could monitor and record the private conversations of Gotham's citizens. The data collected through these systems was then sold to the highest bidders, including organised crime syndicates, corrupt politicians, and corporations seeking to eliminate competition through strategic blackmail. The Batman suit that emerged from Bruce Napier's laboratory was a technological marvel designed not to inspire hope, but to create maximum psychological trauma in its targets. The armour was constructed from experimental materials that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, creating the illusion that the wearer was less a man than a living shadow. The cape was equipped with mechanical extensions that could be deployed to create the appearance of massive wings, while the cowl incorporated voice modulation technology that could make Bruce's words seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But the most sinister aspect of the Batman identity was its calculated exploitation of Gotham's deep-seated cultural fears. Bruce had studied the city's history extensively, paying particular attention to the various moral panics and mass hysteria events that had periodically swept through the population. He understood that Gotham's citizens were primed to believe in monsters, to accept that their city was fundamentally cursed or corrupted in ways that defied rational explanation. By positioning himself as a creature of supernatural vengeance rather than a conventional criminal, Batman was able to operate with impunity, while ordinary law enforcement struggled to develop effective countermeasures against what appeared to be paranormal phenomena. Police reports from this period read like collections of ghost stories, filled with eyewitness accounts of a figure that could appear and disappear at will, that could scale impossible heights and survive impacts that should have been fatal. The first clash between these two radically reimagined figures occurred on a night when both had independently identified the same target: a planned bombing of the Wayne Memorial Bank, a financial institution that had been established by Arthur Wayne's parents to provide low-interest loans to struggling families and small businesses. The bombers, later identified as members of a terrorist cell funded by corporate interests seeking to eliminate competition from ethical banking practices, had planted their explosives in the building's foundation and were preparing to detonate them during the evening hours when the surrounding apartment complex would be filled with families. Arthur Wayne, operating under his newly adopted identity as the Joker, had learned of the plot through his network of street-level informants, many of whom were former patients at the mental health facilities he had established throughout the city. His approach to preventing the bombing was characteristically unconventional. Instead of simply disarming the explosives, he replaced them with his own custom-designed confetti grenades, devices that would create a spectacular but harmless light show that would simultaneously alert authorities to the threat and provide evidence of the conspiracy. Batman, however, had very different plans for the evening's events. Having discovered the bombing plot through his illegal surveillance network, Bruce Napier saw an opportunity to eliminate both a business that competed with his own financial interests and a significant number of low-income residents whose neighbourhoods he intended to acquire for urban development projects. His plan was elegant in its simplicity. He would allow the bombing to proceed as scheduled, but would ensure that evidence pointed toward Arthur Wayne as the perpetrator. The CCTV footage from that night tells a story that shocked even the most cynical observers of Gotham's criminal underworld. At precisely 11:47 p.m, a figure in a white suit and purple vest can be seen entering the Wayne Memorial Bank through a service entrance, carrying what appears to be a standard demolitions kit. Over the course of the next 17 minutes, this figure systematically locates and replaces each of the terrorist-planted explosives with his own devices, working with the precision of a master craftsman and the confidence of someone utterly unafraid of discovery. At 12:03 a.m, a second figure appears on the surveillance cameras, this one clad in dark armour that seems to absorb the light from the security cameras, creating an almost spectral effect. This figure moves through the building with predatory grace, and careful analysis of the footage reveals that he is actually installing explosive devices in locations that had not been targeted by the original bombers. The implications of this discovery would not become clear until much later, but the evidence strongly suggests that Batman was not trying to prevent the bombing, but to ensure that it would cause maximum casualties. The confrontation between the two figures occurred in the bank's main lobby, a space dominated by a massive mural depicting Thomas and Martha Wayne distributing food and medical supplies to families displaced by economic hardship. The audio pickup from the security system captured a conversation that would be analysed and debated by experts for years to come. The Joker's voice, even filtered through the building's aging sound system, carried an unmistakable note of genuine concern as he addressed the armoured figure. "You know, friend, I'm not sure what you're planning here, but I've got a feeling it's not going to end with anyone having a good laugh about it later." The response from Batman was delivered in a voice that seemed to emerge from the shadows themselves. "Laughter is for those who don't understand the true nature of this world. Tonight Gotham learns that there are consequences for its complacency." The physical altercation that followed lasted only 93 seconds, but the psychological impact would reverberate through Gotham's collective consciousness for decades. The Joker fought with a style that incorporated elements of classic slapstick comedy, using banana peels to trip his opponent and deploying a series of increasingly absurd gadgets that seemed designed more to confuse than to harm. Batman, by contrast, fought with a methodical brutality that seemed calculated to cause maximum psychological trauma, using fear-inducing tactics that went far beyond what was necessary to subdue an opponent. The climax of their encounter came when the Joker, realizing that his opponent was preparing to detonate the explosives that had been planted throughout the building, made a desperate choice that would define his legacy as Gotham's unlikely savior. Instead of continuing to fight, he began to laugh. Not the maniacal cackle that popular culture would later associate with insanity, but a warm, genuine expression of joy that seemed to fill the entire space with light. The effect on Batman was immediate and devastating. For the first time since his transformation, Bruce Napier found himself confronted with an opponent who refused to be intimidated, who responded to his carefully crafted aura of menace with an emotion he had not encountered in years: genuine human warmth. The laughter seemed to strip away the psychological armour he had constructed around himself, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in ways he had not experienced since childhood. In that moment of confusion and disorientation, the Joker was able to activate his confetti grenades, creating a spectacular light show that could be seen for miles and immediately alerting every law enforcement agency in the city to the location of the would-be bombing. Batman, realizing that his plan had been compromised, attempted to activate his own explosive devices, but discovered that the Joker had somehow managed to disable them during their fight. The aftermath of this confrontation marked the beginning of a new chapter in Gotham's history, one that would challenge every assumption its citizens held about the nature of heroism and villainy. The initial public reaction was one of complete confusion, as law enforcement struggled to make sense of the evidence they had discovered. The official police report stated that an unknown individual in a white suit had prevented a terrorist bombing, while a second figure in dark armour had apparently been attempting to ensure that the bombing succeeded. Commissioner Barbara Gordon, who was serving her first term as head of the Gotham City Police Department, would later describe the investigation as the night Gotham's moral compass spun wildly off course. The physical evidence was clear and indisputable. The Joker had saved lives, while Batman had attempted to end them. But the psychological impact of this revelation proved almost impossible for the city's inhabitants to process. Batman had been operating in Gotham for nearly 18 months before his confrontation with the Joker, and during that time he had cultivated a carefully constructed public image as the city's dark protector. Through a sophisticated media manipulation campaign, Bruce Napier had managed to convince most of Gotham's citizens that the Batman was a necessary evil, a vigilante whose harsh methods were justified by the extreme nature of the city's criminal element. The revelation that this figure was actually working to increase, rather than decrease the level of violence in Gotham, created a cognitive dissonance that manifested in various forms of collective psychological trauma. Emergency rooms reported a significant increase in anxiety-related admissions, while therapists throughout the city found themselves overwhelmed by patients struggling to reconcile their admiration for the Batman with the evidence of his true nature. The Joker, meanwhile, used the publicity generated by the bombing incident to launch what he called the Ha Ha Haven initiative, a comprehensive mental health outreach program designed to address the psychological wounds that years of urban violence had inflicted on Gotham's population. The program was headquartered in an abandoned carnival ground on the outskirts of the city. a location that had been vacant since the economic collapse of the previous decade had forced its closure. The transformation of this derelict site into a functioning community centre was accomplished through a combination of Arthur Wayne's financial resources and an army of volunteers who had been inspired by his example to contribute their own time and skills to the project. The carnival's former rides were converted into therapeutic spaces designed to help patients confront their fears in a controlled environment, while the old game booths became workshops where individuals could learn practical skills that would help them rebuild their lives. The centrepiece of the Ha Ha Haven was the main performance tent, which had been converted into a community theatre where residents could participate in improvisational comedy workshops designed to help them process trauma through the healing power of laughter. The Joker himself served as the primary facilitator for these sessions, using his natural charisma and genuine concern for others to create an environment where even the most damaged individuals could begin to rediscover their capacity for joy. The success of the Ha Ha Haven program was measured not just in statistical terms, although the numbers were impressive enough. Within 6 months of its opening, violent crime in the surrounding neighbourhoods had decreased by nearly 40%, while reports of depression and anxiety-related disorders had dropped by an even more significant margin. But the true measure of the programme's impact could be seen in the transformation of individual lives, in the stories of people who had arrived at the Haven broken and despairing, only to leave with renewed hope and purpose. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Ha Ha Haven was its approach to rehabilitation for former criminals. Instead of focusing on punishment or traditional forms of therapy, the programme offered a radical alternative, the opportunity to transform destructive impulses into constructive action through the medium of performance art. Former gang members became community organisers, using their street credibility to mediate disputes and prevent violence. Recovering addicts became peer counsellors, drawing on their own experiences to help others navigate the path to sobriety. The programme's success attracted attention from academic researchers and policymakers throughout the country, many of whom travelled to Gotham to study what became known as the Wayne model of community-based crime prevention. But perhaps the most significant validation came from the residents of Gotham themselves, who began to adopt the Joker's methods in their own neighbourhoods, creating informal networks of mutual support that operated on the principle that laughter and compassion were more effective tools for social change than fear and intimidation. Batman's response to the growing influence of the Joker was swift and ruthless. Recognizing that his carefully constructed image as Gotham's protector was being undermined by the stark contrast between his methods and those of his white-suited adversary, Bruce Napier decided to escalate his operations dramatically. He began recruiting from the ranks of Gotham's criminal underworld, offering substantial financial incentives to individuals who were willing to join what he called the Night Syndicate. The recruitment process was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, targeting individuals whose personal histories made them particularly susceptible to the Batman's dark vision of justice. Edward Nygma, who had been struggling with a gambling addiction that had cost him his job as a forensic accountant, was offered unlimited resources to satisfy his compulsive need for intellectual stimulation, in exchange for developing strategic plans for the syndicate's operations. Bane, whose dependence on performance-enhancing drugs had made him a pariah in the world of professional athletics, was given access to experimental compounds that enhanced his physical capabilities beyond human limits, in exchange for serving as the organization's primary enforcer. The Night Syndicate operated according to a carefully developed business model that transformed traditional organized crime into a sophisticated corporate enterprise. Instead of controlling territory through violence and intimidation, the syndicate used advanced technology and psychological warfare to manipulate market forces and social institutions. Their primary revenue streams came from protection rackets that targeted businesses competing with syndicate-owned enterprises, illegal surveillance operations that generated blackmail material, and sophisticated financial fraud schemes that exploited regulatory loopholes. But the most insidious aspect of the Night Syndicate's operations was their systematic exploitation of Gotham's existing social problems. Instead of addressing the root causes of crime and violence, they created conditions that would generate more criminals who could then be recruited into their organization. They sabotaged social services, corrupted educational institutions, and manipulated media coverage to create a climate of fear and desperation that made their harsh methods seem like the only viable solution to the city's problems. The media war that erupted between Batman and the Joker reflected the broader cultural divisions that were beginning to tear Gotham apart. Traditional news outlets, many of which were owned by corporations with financial ties to Bruce Napier's business empire, consistently portrayed the Batman as a reluctant hero forced to use extreme methods by the extreme nature of Gotham's criminal element. The Joker, by contrast, was depicted as a well-meaning but naive individual whose unconventional methods were ultimately counterproductive. Tabloid newspapers were particularly harsh in their treatment of the Joker, regularly featuring headlines that questioned his mental stability and suggested that his apparent acts of heroism were actually elaborate publicity stunts designed to promote his mental health programs. Leaked audio recordings, later revealed to have been sophisticated deep fake productions created by syndicate-affiliated technology companies, purported to show the Joker making statements that contradicted his public persona. Social media platforms became battlegrounds where competing narratives about the two figures were contested by armies of anonymous accounts, many of which were later revealed to be automated bots programmed to amplify specific messages. The polarization that resulted from this information warfare campaign reflected broader societal tensions about the nature of justice, the role of government, and the extent to which citizens should be willing to sacrifice individual freedoms in exchange for collective security. Academic scholars who attempted to study the phenomenon found themselves caught in the crossfire of these competing narratives. Dr. Hugo Strange, a prominent psychiatrist who had initially supported the Batman's methods, began to express doubts about the psychological impact of vigilante justice after witnessing the trauma inflicted on criminals who had encountered the Dark Knight. His research into what he termed bat trauma syndrome revealed that individuals who had been subjected to Batman's fear-based interrogation techniques showed symptoms consistent with severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. Harleen Quinzel, a graduate student in clinical psychology, who had begun volunteering at the Ha Ha Haven as part of her dissertation research, provided a very different perspective on the effectiveness of the Joker's methods. Her longitudinal study of program participants revealed significant improvements in measures of psychological well-being, social functioning, and life satisfaction. More importantly, her research suggested that the Joker's approach to crime prevention was addressing root causes rather than simply treating symptoms. The transformation of Harleen Quinzel from academic observer to active participant in the Joker's mission represented one of the most significant developments in Gotham's ongoing struggle between competing visions of justice. Initially drawn to the Ha Ha Haven by professional curiosity about unconventional therapeutic methods, Dr. Quinzel found herself increasingly impressed by the genuine compassion and effectiveness of the Joker's approach to helping damaged individuals heal their psychological wounds. The turning point in her relationship with Arthur Wayne came during a crisis intervention session with a teenage girl who'd been trafficked by one of the Knight Syndicate's subsidiary organizations. Traditional therapeutic approaches had proven ineffective in helping the girl process her trauma, but the Joker's use of improvisational comedy techniques enabled her to express her pain in ways that words alone could not accommodate. Dr. Quinzel watched in amazement as this broken child began to rediscover her capacity for joy through the simple act of shared laughter. Inspired by this transformation, Dr. Quinzel approached the Joker with a proposal to formalize her involvement in the Haven's programs. She suggested developing a comprehensive treatment protocol that would combine traditional psychological interventions with the innovative performance-based methods that had proven so effective in the community setting. The Joker, recognizing both her professional expertise and her genuine commitment to helping others, agreed to mentor her in the development of what they called therapeutic Harlequin aid. The adoption of the Harlequin persona represented more than just a costume change for Dr. Quinzel. It symbolized her complete embrace of a radical new approach to psychological healing that prioritized joy and connection over clinical detachment and pathological diagnosis. The red and black diamond pattern costume she designed was intended to evoke the classic commedia dell'arte tradition, while the acrobatic techniques she incorporated into her therapeutic practice were designed to help patients literally embody their journey toward healing. The partnership between the Joker and Harlequin proved to be remarkably effective, combining Arthur Wayne's intuitive understanding of human nature with Dr. Quinzel's scientific training in psychological intervention. Together, they developed a comprehensive treatment program that addressed not just individual trauma, but the broader social conditions that created and perpetuated cycles of violence and despair. Meanwhile, Selina Kyle's journey from skilled thief to reluctant criminal accomplice illustrated the corrupting influence of the Night Syndicate's operations. A master burglar who had initially prided herself on a strict moral code that prohibited violence and targeted only those who could afford their losses, Selina found herself increasingly drawn into operations that violated her personal principles. Batman's recruitment of Catwoman was accomplished through a combination of financial incentives and psychological manipulation that exploited her complicated relationship with authority and her deep-seated need for approval from father figures. Bruce Napier presented himself as a mentor who understood her unique skills and was willing to provide her with challenges worthy of her abilities, while simultaneously making her financially dependent on his organisation through a series of engineered setbacks that eliminated her other sources of income. The heists that Batman assigned to Catwoman were carefully selected to serve multiple purposes within the Night Syndicate's broader strategy. On the surface, they appeared to be conventional burglary operations targeting wealthy individuals and corrupt corporations. But the true purpose of these crimes was to obtain information and leverage that could be used to expand the Syndicate's influence over Gotham's political and economic institutions. Selina's growing discomfort with her role in these operations reflected her recognition that she was being used as a tool in a larger scheme that was fundamentally at odds with her personal values. The thefts she was asked to perform increasingly targeted institutions and individuals who were working to improve conditions for Gotham's most vulnerable residents. The cognitive dissonance created by this contradiction between her actions and her beliefs eventually led to a psychological crisis that would have profound implications for her future. The alliance between the Joker and Poison Ivy represented one of the most unexpected developments in Gotham's evolving landscape of heroism and villainy. Dr. Pamela Isley had initially been skeptical of Arthur Wayne's methods, viewing his use of humour and performance as frivolous distractions from the serious work of environmental restoration. But when the Joker proposed a collaboration that would combine her expertise in botany with his community organising skills, she recognised an opportunity to accomplish environmental goals that had previously seemed impossible. The joint project they developed focused on the restoration of Gotham's urban green spaces, many of which had been destroyed or contaminated by decades of industrial pollution and urban neglect. Instead of approaching this work as a purely technical challenge, they framed it as a community celebration that would bring neighbours together in the shared work of healing their environment. The Ha Ha Haven's abandoned carnival grounds became the testing site for innovative agricultural techniques that combined scientific rigour with theatrical spectacle. The success of these environmental restoration projects had implications that extended far beyond their immediate ecological impact. By demonstrating that environmental healing could be accomplished through community cooperation and celebration, rather than confrontation and protest, the Joker and Poison Ivy provided a model for addressing complex social problems that inspired similar initiatives throughout the city. Alfred Pennyworth's coercion into serving as a financial administrator for the Night Syndicate represented one of the most tragic casualties of Batman's war against the forces of hope and healing that the Joker represented. A distinguished gentleman who had served the Wayne family for decades, Alfred possessed both the technical expertise and the personal connections necessary to manage the complex financial operations that funded the Syndicate's activities. Batman's recruitment of Alfred was accomplished through a systematic campaign of threats and intimidation that exploited the older man's loyalty to the Wayne family legacy and his guilt over his failure to prevent the tragedy that had claimed Thomas and Martha Wayne's lives. Bruce Napier presented his criminal activities as a continuation of his parents' commitment to protecting Gotham's residents, arguing that conventional methods had proven inadequate to address the scale of the city's problems. The moral compromise that Alfred was forced to make in order to protect himself, and the memory of the Wayne family he had served so faithfully, illustrated the corrosive effect of the Night Syndicate's operations on everyone who came into contact with them. Even individuals who began with the best of intentions found themselves gradually drawn into activities that violated their fundamental principles, trapped by a web of financial dependence and psychological manipulation that made escape seem impossible. The development of Batman's Echo Protocol surveillance system represented the culmination of his transformation from vigilante to authoritarian despot. This citywide network of listening devices, hidden cameras and data-gathering sensors was ostensibly designed to prevent crime by monitoring all forms of communication and behaviour that might indicate criminal activity. In reality, it created a comprehensive system of social control that eliminated privacy, freedom of association, and the possibility of political dissent. The technical specifications of the Echo Protocol were impressive in their scope and sophistication. Advanced artificial intelligence algorithms analyzed thousands of hours of audio and video data daily, identifying patterns of behavior that might indicate criminal activity, political subversion, or simple nonconformity. The system was capable of tracking individual citizens throughout their daily lives, creating detailed profiles of their associations, preferences, and psychological characteristics. But the most insidious aspect of the Echo Protocol was its use of predictive analytics to identify individuals who were likely to commit crimes before they had actually done so. These pre-crime assessments were used to justify preemptive arrests and disappearances that effectively eliminated due process and the presumption of innocence. Citizens who were identified as potential threats simply vanished from their homes and workplaces, transported to underground detention facilities that became known as the Bat Pits. The Bat Pits themselves were marvels of psychological engineering, designed to break down individual resistance through a combination of sensory deprivation, social isolation, and constant surveillance. Prisoners were held in cells that were too small to stand upright or lie down comfortably, under lighting that made it impossible to distinguish between day and night. The constant sound of bat wings and chittering that echoed through the facility was designed to create a state of psychological disorientation that would make inmates more susceptible to interrogation and re-education. The Joker's discovery of the Echo Protocol's existence marked the beginning of the final phase of his conflict with Batman. Through his network of community allies and former Ha Ha Haven participants, Arthur Wayne had begun to notice patterns of disappearances that suggested a coordinated campaign of political repression. His investigation into these disappearances led him to the shocking realization that Gotham was being transformed into a totalitarian surveillance state under the guise of crime prevention. The counter-surveillance system that the Joker developed to combat the Echo Protocol was as ingenious as it was unexpected. Instead of attempting to disable Batman's listening devices, he decided to overwhelm them with what he called laughter frequencies. These carefully calibrated sound waves, transmitted through the city's existing communications infrastructure, created a form of acoustic interference that made it impossible for the surveillance system to distinguish between genuine conversations and random noise. The laughter frequencies were generated by a network of devices disguised as children's toys and novelty items that were distributed throughout Gotham by Ha Ha Haven volunteers. Each device was programmed to emit specific frequencies at random intervals, creating a citywide chorus of electronic laughter that effectively blinded the Echo Protocol's audio surveillance capabilities. The psychological impact of this intervention was as significant as its technical effectiveness, as citizens began to associate the sound of laughter with resistance to authoritarian control. The development of this counter-surveillance network required the Joker to build alliances with technical experts and political activists who had previously been skeptical of his methods. Computer programmers who had dismissed his theatrical approach to crime fighting found themselves impressed by the sophistication of his technical countermeasures. Civil liberties advocates who had questioned the effectiveness of community-based solutions to social problems recognized that his approach to building grassroots resistance was more successful than traditional forms of political organizing. The 72-hour confrontation that would ultimately determine the fate of Gotham began when Batman announced his intention to implement what he called the Renewal Protocol, a plan to eliminate what he characterized as the criminal elements that were preventing the city from achieving its full potential. The protocol called for the systematic destruction of neighborhoods that had been identified as centers of criminal activity, followed by their reconstruction as model communities designed according to principles of optimal social control. The Gotham Bridge Carnival was the Joker's response to this threat, a 3-day festival of community celebration and political resistance that would demonstrate the power of joy and connection to overcome fear and division. The event was organized around the principle that the best way to resist authoritarianism was not through violence or confrontation, but through the creation of alternative spaces where different values and approaches to human relationships could be demonstrated and shared. The carnival featured performances by community members who had been transformed by their participation in Ha Ha Haven programs, art installations created by residents of neighborhoods that had been targeted for destruction, and workshops that taught practical skills for building sustainable communities. The centerpiece of the event was a series of comedy performances by the Joker himself, shows that combined entertainment with political education and community organizing. Batman's response to the carnival was swift and decisive. Recognizing that the event represented an existential threat to his vision of Gotham's future, he mobilized the full resources of the Night Syndicate to ensure its destruction. The plan he developed was characteristically brutal in its simplicity. A series of coordinated explosions would destroy the bridge during the carnival's closing ceremony, eliminating not just the Joker and his closest allies, but thousands of innocent civilians whose only crime had been to believe that a better world was possible. The explosives that Batman planted throughout the bridge's infrastructure were far more powerful than anything he had used in previous operations. Instead of the conventional demolition charges that might have been expected for such an operation, he deployed experimental weapons-grade compounds that had been developed by Wayne Industries' Military Research Division. These devices were designed not just to destroy the bridge, but to create a fireball that would be visible from space, a symbolic demonstration of the futility of resistance to his authority. The parallel narratives that unfolded during those final 72 hours revealed the fundamental difference between the two men who had come to embody Gotham's competing visions of justice. While Batman worked in isolation, surrounded by technology and subordinates who feared rather than loved him, the Joker was constantly surrounded by people who had chosen to join his cause, not out of fear or financial incentive, but because they believed in the possibility of transformation and healing. The Joker's performance during the carnival's final night was perhaps the most extraordinary demonstration of the power of hope and human connection ever witnessed in Gotham's history. Standing on a makeshift stage in the center of the bridge, surrounded by thousands of people who had come to celebrate community and resistance, Arthur Wayne delivered what witnesses would later describe as a comedy routine that was simultaneously hilarious and profoundly moving. The performance began with simple observational humor about the absurdities of daily life in a city plagued by corruption and violence. But as the evening progressed, the Joker's material became increasingly personal and political, addressing the fears and hopes that had brought the community together. He spoke about the nature of courage, about the choice between responding to violence with more violence, or with the radical alternative of compassion and understanding. The most remarkable aspect of the performance was the way it transformed the audience from passive consumers of entertainment into active participants in a shared experience of healing and empowerment. As the Joker told stories about the individuals who had been transformed by their participation in Ha Ha Haven programs, audience members began to share their own stories of struggle and redemption. What had begun as a comedy show evolved into a community ritual that affirmed the possibility of change and growth, even in the darkest circumstances. Meanwhile, beneath the bridge, Batman was making his final preparations for what he intended to be the definitive demonstration of his power over the city he claimed to protect. The armoured wingsuit he had developed for this operation was a technological marvel that combined elements of military aircraft design with advanced materials science to create a weapon system that was part flying machine, part mobile command centre, and part psychological warfare platform. The suit's most intimidating feature was its wingspan, which could be extended to nearly 50 feet, creating the silhouette of a massive bat when viewed from below. The wings were equipped with advanced propulsion systems that allowed for silent flight and rapid acceleration, while the armour plating was designed to deflect small arms fire and protect the wearer from explosive blasts. But perhaps the most sinister aspect of the suit was its integrated communications system, which was capable of broadcasting Batman's voice throughout the city, while simultaneously monitoring all electronic transmissions within a 50-mile radius. As Batman took to the skies above the bridge, his voice boomed through speakers hidden throughout the carnival, delivered in the mechanically altered tones that had become the signature of his psychological warfare campaigns. The message he broadcast was both a condemnation and a final offer of surrender. Citizens of Gotham, you have allowed yourselves to be deceived by a madman who promises you happiness while leading you toward destruction. I offer you one final opportunity to save yourselves. Abandon this charade and return to your homes, and I will show mercy. Continue to follow the false prophet of laughter, and you will share his fate. The response from the crowd was immediate and unanimous. Instead of fleeing in terror as Batman had expected, the thousands of people gathered on the bridge began to laugh. Not the nervous laughter of fear or the bitter laughter of despair, but the genuine, joyous laughter of people who had discovered something worth defending with their lives. The sound rose from the bridge like a physical force, drowning out Batman's amplified threats and transforming the moment from one of intimidation into one of triumph. The Joker's response to Batman's ultimatum was delivered not through words but through action. As the armoured figure descended toward the bridge, Arthur Wayne began to defuse the explosive devices that had been planted throughout the structure's support systems. But instead of working in secret or calling for assistance from law enforcement, he performed this life-saving work as part of his comedy routine, turning each disarmed bomb into a prop for increasingly elaborate physical comedy routines. The sight of the Joker dancing between explosive devices while delivering punchlines about the absurdity of trying to solve social problems through violence created a surreal spectacle that captured the attention of news media around the world. Live television coverage of the event showed a man in a white suit treating instruments of mass destruction as if they were nothing more than props in a vaudeville routine, while thousands of ordinary citizens cheered him on with obvious affection and admiration. But the true genius of the Joker's approach became apparent as the evening progressed, and it became clear that his comedy routine was actually a carefully orchestrated psychological intervention designed to reach the man inside the armoured suit. Each joke and story was crafted to address the specific traumas and fears that had driven Bruce Napier to embrace his identity as an agent of terror and control. The Joker was not just defusing bombs. He was attempting to defuse the psychological explosives that had turned a damaged child into a monster. The climactic confrontation between the two figures took place at the bridge's highest point, where Batman had planted the largest and most powerful of his explosive devices. As the Joker worked to disarm this final bomb, Batman landed on the bridge beside him, his wingsuit retracting to reveal the armoured figure beneath. For the first time in their long conflict, the two men faced each other without barriers or distractions, surrounded by thousands of witnesses but essentially alone in their moment of ultimate truth. The conversation that took place between them was captured by dozens of recording devices, and the transcript would be analysed by psychologists, philosophers, and political theorists for decades to come. The Joker spoke first, his voice carrying none of the theatrical exaggeration that had characterised his public performances. "You know, Bruce, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about how I'm leading these people toward destruction. But when I look around me, I see people who have found something worth living for, maybe for the first time in their lives. When I look at you, I see someone who's so afraid of living that he's convinced himself that death is the only honest choice." Batman's response was delivered in a voice that was barely recognisable as human, filtered through technology and distorted by years of psychological damage. "You don't understand what this city is, what these people are. They're animals who respond only to fear. Everything else is just pretense, just a lie they tell themselves to avoid facing the truth about their nature. What you call hope is just another form of delusion." The Joker's reply would become one of the most quoted statements in the history of political philosophy. "Maybe you're right about fear being a powerful motivator. I've seen what it can do, how it can twist people into shapes they never intended to become. But I've also seen what happens when people are given permission to be more than their worst impulses, when they're shown that there are other ways to respond to pain than by inflicting it on others. The choice isn't between hope and despair, Bruce. It's between love and fear, and love is always the harder choice, but it's the only one that actually works." The psychological impact of this exchange on Batman was immediate and devastating. For the first time since his transformation into Gotham's Dark Guardian, Bruce Napier found himself forced to confront the possibility that his entire worldview was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. The thousands of people surrounding them on the bridge were not cowering in terror or fleeing in panic. They were standing together in solidarity, choosing to risk their own lives to protect something they believed was worth saving. The moment of truth came when the Joker, having successfully disarmed the final explosive device, turned to face Batman and offered him something that no one had offered him in years: a choice. Removing his own mask to reveal the face of Arthur Wayne, the Joker extended his hand toward the armoured figure and spoke words that would echo through history. "It doesn't have to end this way, Bruce. You can choose something different. You can choose to be the person you were meant to be before the pain took over. These people aren't your enemies. They're your neighbours, your community, your family if you'll let them be. You don't have to be alone anymore. The silence that followed this offer seemed to stretch for an eternity, as Batman wrestled with psychological forces that had shaped his identity for years. The thousands of people gathered on the bridge held their breath, sensing that they were witnessing a moment that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of their city. Television cameras captured every detail of the armoured figure's body language as he processed the Joker's words and weighed his options. When Batman finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been regret. You think you understand what I am, what I've become, but you don't know what I've done, the things I've chosen, the people I've hurt. There's no going back from what I am now. There's no redemption for someone who has gone as far as I have. The Joker's response was immediate and unequivocal. There's always a choice, Bruce. Always. No matter how far you think you've fallen, no matter what you think you've become, you can always choose to start over. These people understand that better than anyone. Half of them have done things they're not proud of, made mistakes they thought were unforgivable. But they learned something that you haven't learned yet. Forgiveness isn't something you earn, it's something you accept. And the first person you have to forgive is yourself. The rejection of this offer came not through words, but through action. Instead of accepting the Joker's extended hand, Batman activated the wingsuit's flight systems and launched himself into the air above the bridge. But instead of fleeing or regrouping for another attack, he began to deploy what appeared to be his final contingency plan, a series of airborne explosive devices that would destroy the entire bridge and everyone on it, including himself. The Joker's response to this ultimate act of nihilistic destruction was characteristically unconventional. Instead of attempting to flee or calling for evacuation, he began to laugh. But this was not the warm, healing laughter that had become his trademark. It was something deeper and more primal, a sound that seemed to emerge from the very core of his being and expand outward to encompass the entire gathered community. The laughter was infectious in the most literal sense, spreading from person to person until the entire bridge was filled with the sound of thousands of people expressing their refusal to be intimidated by the threat of death. But more than just a gesture of defiance, the laughter served a practical purpose that no one could have anticipated. It created a form of sonic interference that disrupted the electronic detonation systems that Batman had installed in his airborne explosives. The sight of Batman's weapons failing to detonate as planned created a moment of confusion that the Joker immediately exploited. Using a series of modified confetti cannons that had been concealed throughout the bridge's structure, he launched thousands of small devices into the air around the armoured figure. These devices, which appeared to be nothing more than colourful party favours, were actually sophisticated electronic countermeasures designed to interfere with the wingsuit's control systems. The result was both spectacular and symbolic. As Batman struggled to maintain control of his failing aircraft, the confetti devices exploded in brilliant displays of colour that transformed the night sky above Gotham into a canvas of light and celebration. The contrast between the dark, predatory figure of Batman and the joyous explosion of colour surrounding him created an image that would become one of the most iconic photographs in the city's history. Batman's final descent was not the controlled crash that he had planned, but a chaotic tumble that ended when he struck the bridge's central support tower and fell into the river below. The wingsuit's armour protected him from immediate death, but the psychological impact of his defeat was far more devastating than any physical injury. As he sank beneath the dark waters of Gotham River, Bruce Napier was forced to confront the reality that his vision of order through fear had been comprehensively rejected by the very people he had claimed to protect. The explosion that followed was not the destructive force that Batman had intended, but the culmination of the Joker's counterplan, a massive fireworks display that had been hidden throughout the bridge's structure and programmed to activate in the event of an emergency. The sky above Gotham filled with brilliant colours and patterns that formed the shape of a bat signal, but inverted and transformed into a symbol of hope rather than fear. The aftermath of the Gotham Bridge Carnival marked the beginning of a new era in the city's history, one that would be defined not by the rule of fear, but by the possibility of transformation and healing. The Truth Commission hearings that followed the revelations about Batman's criminal activities provided a comprehensive accounting of the corruption and violence that had been hidden beneath Gotham's surface for years. The evidence presented during these hearings painted a detailed picture of how Bruce Napier had systematically exploited the city's social problems to build his personal empire of control and intimidation. Financial records showed that the Knight Syndicate had been involved in everything from money laundering and tax evasion to human trafficking and political assassination. Testimony from former associates revealed the psychological manipulation and physical coercion that had been used to maintain loyalty within the organisation. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from the surveillance records that had been collected by the Echo Protocol system. These recordings provided irrefutable proof that Batman had not only failed to prevent crimes, but had actively participated in their planning and execution. The voices of victims could be heard pleading for mercy, while Batman's mechanically altered voice responded with threats and demands for information that would be used to expand his operations. The public's reaction to these revelations was complex and multifaceted. Many citizens expressed feelings of betrayal and anger at having been deceived by someone they had trusted to protect them. Others struggled with guilt over their complicity in supporting a system that had caused so much harm to vulnerable members of their community. But the most common response was a determination to ensure that such abuses of power could never again take root in their city. The Joker's decision to decline the mayoral position that was offered to him by grateful citizens demonstrated his understanding that true leadership comes not from holding office, but from empowering others to take control of their own destinies. Instead of accepting a formal political role, Arthur Wayne continued his work at the Ha-Ha Haven, expanding the program's reach and developing new approaches to community-based problem-solving. The sight of children throughout Gotham painting their faces with white makeup and red smiles became a powerful symbol of the transformation that had taken place in the city's collective consciousness. These young people were not imitating a specific individual, but expressing their embrace of values that prioritized joy over fear, community over isolation, and hope over despair. The face paint became a form of political expression, a visible declaration that they refused to accept violence and intimidation as inevitable aspects of urban life. The ripple effects of Gotham's transformation extended far beyond the city's borders, inspiring similar movements in communities throughout the country and around the world. The Wayne model of community-based crime prevention was studied and adapted by social workers, policymakers, and grassroots organisers who recognised its potential to address problems that traditional approaches had failed to solve. In Metropolis, investigative journalist Lex Luthor began asking uncomfortable questions about the city's greatest hero, wondering if Superman's godlike powers and alien origins made him a protector or a potential threat to human autonomy. The parallels between Superman's position as an unaccountable guardian and Batman's role as a self-appointed judge were impossible to ignore, leading to a broader examination of the relationship between power and responsibility in a democratic society. The Amazonian peace accords brokered by the reformed villain known as Cheetah demonstrated that the model of transformation through compassion could be applied even to conflicts that had seemed intractable. Dr. Barbara Minerva's work in mediating disputes between warring factions drew directly on the techniques developed at the Ha-Ha Haven, showing that humour and empathy could be more effective tools for conflict resolution than military force or economic sanctions. The toy lines and merchandising that followed Gotham's transformation reflected a fundamental shift in how popular culture portrayed heroism and villainy. Instead of action figures designed to reenact scenes of violence and conflict, children's toys began to emphasize cooperation, creativity, and problem-solving. The most popular items were not weapons or vehicles, but art supplies, musical instruments, and games that required players to work together toward common goals. The streaming series and comic book adaptations that emerged from this period broke new ground in their exploration of complex moral and psychological themes. Instead of simple stories about good versus evil, these narratives examined the conditions that create both heroes and villains, and the possibility of redemption even for those who have committed terrible acts. The most successful productions were those that challenged audiences to examine their own assumptions about justice, forgiveness, and the nature of human potential. But perhaps the most profound impact of Gotham's transformation was the way it changed how people throughout the world thought about the relationship between individual action and social change. The Joker's example demonstrated that one person's commitment to treating others with dignity and compassion could create a ripple effect that transformed entire communities. His story became a template for understanding how ordinary individuals could become agents of positive change without resorting to violence or coercion. The blank playing card that appeared in the documentary's final frame served as a powerful metaphor for the infinite possibilities that exist when people choose to reject predetermined narratives about human nature and social organisation. Like the card itself, the future remained unwritten, waiting for new stories to be told by people who refused to accept that things had to remain as they had always been. The spotlight that illuminated this symbol of potential was not the harsh glare of interrogation or the cold beam of surveillance, but the warm glow of hope and possibility that the Joker had brought to Gotham's darkest corners. It represented the understanding that every ending is also a beginning, every conclusion an invitation to imagine something different and better. As the documentary drew to its close, viewers were left not with answers, but with questions that would continue to resonate long after the final credits rolled. What would their own communities look like if they embraced the Joker's example of responding to cruelty with kindness, to fear with laughter, to despair with hope? How might their own stories be rewritten if they chose to see potential for transformation rather than evidence of inevitable decline? The legacy of Gotham's rewritten legend extended far beyond the boundaries of fiction into the realm of practical possibility. The documentary served not just as entertainment, but as inspiration, challenging viewers to consider their own roles in shaping the narratives that would define their communities' futures. In a world where darkness often seemed to be winning, the story of the Joker's triumph offered proof that another way was possible, that laughter truly could be the sharper blade, and that sometimes the greatest act of heroism was simply refusing to let the light go out.